reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It's wonderful to see you once again. Thanks for coming on in here and learning a bit more about gender diversity with me. I'm learning too as we go through the literature to answer questions that come in from public figures, posed as they often are in the form of confident declaration. And this week we have a bit of a corker. For those who don't know, the UK government is right now in the middle of producing, maybe even finalising, guidance for schools on working with gender diverse folk in the stages of questioning and coming out. And it's designed to kind of help school staff to navigate what are kind of very challenging waters. And at a time when they don't have guidance and are really kind of guided by their own child-centred, valuing the voice of the child principles. And that's a wonderful thing, but they're obviously a bit lost at sea, and no wonder when we have, folks like when she was Attorney General Suella Braverman accusing schools of being inclusive as being discriminating against, the cisgender pupils in the school, and when you have the Good Law Project issuing guidance interpreting the exact same equalities legislation from an independent perspective, basically saying that no, you are discriminating against transgender folk if you're not including them. So schools are really left at sea, and I can understand why the government is trying to get guidance on this subject. We don't know what this guidance will entail, but there has been little whispers, hints, dropped into the public discourse as the government is wont to do. Recently, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, has made comments on this very topic. And maybe this kind of gives us a hint as to the direction of travel for this policy. So let's hear it. Here we are, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak.
Finally, on gender, you'll have seen Policy Exchange's report today, claiming that parents have been kept in the dark in some schools about their children changing gender. Are you concerned? What is your government doing?
So I'm very concerned about these reports. For me, the safety and well-being of our children is of paramount importance. And I've also been clear that parents must be able to know what is being taught to their kids in school, especially on these sensitive areas. That's why we're already reviewing the RHSE guidance to make sure that it is age appropriate for children. But also what I'm also going to say today is that for the summer term, we will make sure that we publish guidance for schools so that they know how to respond when children are asking about their gender. These are really sensitive areas. It's important that we treat them sensitively and that parents know what's going on, and we'll make sure that that happens.
Thanks so very much to the Prime Minister for his interesting question posed, as they often are, in the form of confident declaration. And this one, a little bit kind of whispered at the end there. The whole context of this conversation, and it has come out in a few different ways. It seems that people are concerned about children exploring their gender in school and parents not necessarily being informed. And I can kind of understand that, right? Parental informed consent is something that we consider to be important, as is a child's right to privacy and right to influence proceedings that affect them. So we have two kind of conflicting ethical priorities. And how do we make sense of this? That's a really good question. And I really like the question of, is it reasonable here? Is it reasonable to always, as standard, tell parents when children and young people are exploring their gender in school in one way or another? That's a legitimate question. So let's take a look to the literature to see if we can't find an answer. And this literature is, last time we came together, it was a little bit heavy duty, and I found it heavy too. It was necessary and important, but damn, it really did impact me. This time, we're going to be talking about literature which is actually beautiful. The field of study when it comes to the question of how children and young people explore their gender, how they come out, and how parents are informed by them, how that whole process takes place is very qualitative. It's very child voice led. It's also parental voice led. And we get this really exciting, deep, and very rich look into the lives of children and young people as they navigate the challenges of coming out. And what results is a very beautiful field of literature. I'm going to introduce you to some absolutely gorgeous studies that I think I would like you to go and read, one of which I'd very much like you to go and read. Listen, if you're super busy, you haven't got any time to read anything today, just read this one article. I promise you won't regret it. It's by Grisho Shade, Hillier, Jesh, and Thompson in 2023. Breadcrumbs for Family: How Gender Nonconforming, Non-Binary, and Transgender Adults Give and Receive Gender Messages. LGBTQ plus Family, an Interdisciplinary Journal. This study, it's a really beautiful study. It basically asks people about their experiences of coming out as like young people or as adults, and what are the challenges that get in the way, and what's the experience like, and how do people do it, basically. But more than anything, it's actually beautifully written. I think of myself as an all right writer these days, but damn, I can only aspire to the beauty of the prose in this article. Take a look at it. It's absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to read some of it to you. But essentially, this is our first step, right? We need to understand, how do children and young people come out to families? What are families' reactions? And is it legitimate for schools to interrupt that process, essentially, by forcing kids to come out to their parents, maybe before they're quite ready? So let's read on Grisho Shade's work quite heavily. Before we get started, actually, we're going to need to talk about coming out, because, when you're thinking about coming out, you might think of it as this single event, like you tell people who you are. You've come to a conclusion, you've realized who you are on the inside. Yes, that's right. That feels like home. That's what I am. And then you tell people. And what it turns out is that just isn't the case. It's a gradual, thoughtful, deliberate process. And Grisho Shade and colleagues' description of it is beautiful. They describe it as leaving breadcrumbs, hints, subtle and unconscious and informal hints that let people know in little ways about your experience of your own gender. And not only that, but it's a process of negotiation, between you and your understanding of your gender that evolves not only through your own experimentation and your own reactions internally to that experimentation, but to other people's reaction to that experimentation and your internal reaction to their welcoming or rejection of your experimentation, right? So it's a three-way interaction between your own evolving identity, the hints, little breadcrumbs you leave in the world as you experiment, and how people react to it. Kind of amazing. So this is what I'm talking about. I'm going to give you a quote from this amazing article. A direct quote. They say, "Breadcrumbs involve hints and testing the water, but they are more than that, referring to both the individual pieces of communication strategically placed and the process of dropping, receiving, and making sense of the meaning of their pattern for who we imagine we are allowed to be in the context of family. We call upon this data from our muscles and bones, the folds between tender affirmations, baffling apathy, and devastating rejection we have held, a somatic elicitation. We are not recalling this data from rote academic exercises or theory. Conceptually, the themes of the data point to the breadcrumbs as our cognitive, emotional, and relational habits within our social ways of being, tied together by memory and time, allowing us to quickly and plainly recall patterns and behaviors in ourselves and others." What an absolutely beautiful piece of writing. And I gotta say, I recognize this, right? I'm reading this wider field of literature. This is replicated all over the place. Not everybody can describe it with such beauty, but it is stunning. And I recognize it in my own experience too. I didn't come out until I was 28, but I knew, much like as we've talked about before, most people know something is up in childhood. I just didn't have the language to describe it. And yet I was kind of testing the waters as these participants did, lots of different approaches to doing that they had, whether it be through play, whether it be through dressing up or changing their hair, or whether it be through their behaviors and interests. For me, it was about stealing my mum's clothes. When I was I remember late at night, I'd steal my mum's clothes and I'd wear them in the mirror when I was like in my early teens. And I was like, I'd be there dressed in the mirror and looking at myself, and I'd have that kind of, I was testing the water with myself as much as than anything else, trying to work out what feels like home, what am I? And as I started to do that, I then started to leave breadcrumbs for my parents to follow. I, on one occasion, left my mum's clothes laid out in the lounge for her to find. A trail of breadcrumbs I was both hopeful that she would follow and desperately afraid that she would follow. And what happened for us? Well, nobody spoke to me about it. They followed the breadcrumbs, but they didn't want to let anybody know. They didn't let me know what their thinking was. It became a taboo we never spoke about. And as a consequence, I kind of stayed hidden to stay safe. But as a family, we were in a context that was extremely transphobic. The culture that we evolved in, the culture that we were situated in was deeply, deeply transphobic. And for me to come out, for us as a family to come out, would have been incredibly difficult. And maybe staying secret was the right way to stay safe. Maybe for us, staying in the closet was the best way to stay safe. Now, these findings are basically replicated all over the place, but in a lot of qualitative work, in very different ways of describing it, but essentially testing the waters. But it's described directly like that by Hayden Roots and colleagues in 2023. Their study is titled "Testing the Waters in a World That Refuses to Make Space: Development and Coming Out with Transgender and Non-Binary Adults." Really interesting. They talk about like the timing of coming out to family and friends varying widely for the transgender and non-binary participants from adolescence into early adulthood. And what we find in this study, as we've already described in the wider literature, this kind of dissonance between the age at which people know something is up and the age at which they can come out or talk to people about it. And that, most people knew, even these participants knew, they declare somewhere between the age of 3 and 12. The participants in this study all knew that something was up, but they didn't have the language. Robin in the study, which is a pseudonym, described they didn't initially have the words to go behind how I felt to describe their gender openly. And of course, having that language isn't just about being able to describe your experience to other people. It's also about being able to understand your own experience. And this might be one of the reasons why things are challenging for transgender and non-binary youth in the Western world, probably in the world more broadly, is that they don't really have the language. When we talk about in the world more broadly, the lacking language is a post-colonial problem, right? There are tons of cultural practices that have a language to describe genders outside of the binary, but those cultural practices were often oppressed through colonialism. And what we find is that language gets lost. And in the UK, we just lack that language, except within a kind of more medicalized sense. We could do with more rich understanding of what gender is and a language that we can use to describe it, so that young people can understand their own experiences and can then communicate those experiences to the people around them. But in the absence of that, what we have is a situation where young people find the world isn't prepared for them. They can't find a language to describe their own experiences, and it's not, even when they find a language, they don't necessarily share that language with parents or with wider society, so it becomes difficult to talk to other people about it, and the resistance can be quite strong. We have this amazing quote from this paper from a young person. Coming out when the world just refuses to make space, participants describe the challenges of coming out in a society that often stigmatized and discriminates against them. One participant described the experience like this: "I know that coming out would be difficult, but I didn't realize how much resistance I would face. My family just didn't understand, and some of my friends stopped talking to me. It was like the world just refused to make space for me." And Riley, another really interesting quote, "My next thought wasn't, oh, well, I need to be more open about this. It was, I need to hide this." And the interviewer says, "Yeah, because it's not safe." Riley says, "Yeah, because I'm a freak of nature." The pathologization that people experience about their own identities, I think, comes from this lack of common understanding and language to describe gender experiences outside of the binary, or even transgender experiences within the binary. So where did participants forge this language? It's kind of interesting. I'm not absolutely certain, and I'm not sure it's universal, but from this study, participants described things like being at LGBTQ groups and societies and having peers and developing a shared language. And I imagine online too, developing that shared language. This is an interesting quote. Just talking to people at the LGBTQ group on campus, I was like, well, this makes sense for me. That was my testing the waters, and that's how I came out to my partner, sitting in the environment and coming out little by little and seeing her reaction to it. It's super interesting, right? Like, again, there's just kind of this negotiation between our own kind of selves and our experimentation, our developing of language, our understanding of possibilities, and our understanding of people's reaction to that experimentation, understanding how welcome it is, how risky is it for me to try these things out and to be myself, and is it safe for me to gradually, step by step, come out here? Now, on the other side of this coin, of course, we have parental acceptance and understanding, and that is not a very straightforward process either, of course. Yohal from 2021, Accepting an LGBTQ Child, a stage model for parents of color. Really interesting study. I couldn't find it being published anywhere. It's only in the dissertation literature, but really interesting. They talk about the stages of parents of color coming to terms with their LGBTQ child and their emerging, evolving identity. And it starts with grappling with early awareness of that identity, right? It's a gradual process of understanding, what their child is experiencing and what's going on, and then expressing love and suppressing negative emotions after disclosure. So as the child does that gentle experimentation, people's job becomes to, they are going to feel some kind of way about it, right? And suppressing those negative emotions and still expressing love, prioritizing your child's well-being is what parents do in these circumstances. Seeking education and support and finding a language to describe it, generating an understanding, then facing bias and reconciling conflicting values, right? Trying to reconcile the challenges of feeling uncomfortable about the situation, but loving your child. And then from silence to action, coming out as a family. So not only is this a process, this is super interesting, right? Not only is this a process from between children and their familial environment, their school environment, but it's also a process of the familial environment coming out to wider family or to society, to coming together and coming out. Really interesting. And then finally, focused on child's life stage and making meaning. Once all of this is kind of, a bit more secure in the space, you can focus on the future and continue to develop an understanding of, where do we go from here? Now, looking at the qualitative literature about parental experiences, there's a beautiful study from Sans Fathon. We've heard from this amazing author before. This is from 2020, Parents' Journeys to Acceptance and Support of Gender, Diverse and Trans Children and Youth in the Journal of Family Issues. This is really interesting. They spoke with a bunch of parents about their experience of their gender diverse young person coming out. And there's loads of interesting stuff in this study that's worth a read. But the thing that they focus on, the thing that is most apparent, is that the time it takes for parents to understand and support their young person is long. And they even highlight that even, to the stage where young people are accessing transition-related healthcare, they find that parents continue to struggle with accepting their child even when they're accompanying them to those appointments. So these processes take a long time. And the authors kind of highlight there are 4 stages, very similar to the other work that we've already talked about, that parents educate themselves about gender diversity and understand that support contributes to their child's well-being. Then they allow themselves time to integrate the new reality and adapt to it. Then they obtain support from other parents and then obtain support from professionals. And that supports them in accepting their child and supporting them. The challenge, of course, is that it takes time. And as we've already described, this is a gentle, gradual, deliberate process from diverse children and young people. Gender diversity, children and young people, it's complicated, and they come to understanding through a gradual and deliberate process of essentially leaving breadcrumbs. And from the parental perspective, it takes time to accommodate those breadcrumbs and understand this new reality and to learn about it. It's not something that happens overnight. Now, to close the loop on this little circle here, we have Morgan and colleagues in 2023, Knowledge is Power, Trans Young People's Perceptions of Parental Reactions to Their Gender Identity and Perceived Barriers and Facilitators to Present Parental Support. So these effectively a bunch of young people talk about when their parents found out that they were LGBTQIA+, and what their reactions were to their parents' reactions. And this is really interesting. So some really good quotes in here from young people. From a non-binary young person of 18 years of age, I think it's just a lack of understanding or that extreme maternal caution for your welfare and safety. Okay, don't tell your friends, because what if someone finds out? I support you, but maybe you're too young to know. Which really hurts, but I know that it's also just from a lack of knowing. Another one. I got my sister to draw a couple of figures with flags in them, and I wrote above it, I might be transgender and you can't change that, because I never knew how they felt. But they both hugged me and they're like, it's okay. We don't understand, but we still love you. It will take time for us to get used to the name, but we'll try our best. That's kind of gorgeous, actually. Another quote, it's very clear that the biggest issue for parents is a lack of understanding. I've basically been educating my parents on what it is at every point of the way, and that's so tiring on top of everything else you're dealing with. Another final fantastic quote from this study from a non-binary person of 20 years of age. They say, showing the whole trans perspective for her. That the trans experience isn't just gender dysphoria, etc., that there's also gender euphoria, and that being trans can be a really beautiful and fulfilling experience. Futures can be positive. Hearing that out of the mouths of real trans people is really super, super important and powerful. Fantastic. Again, communicating the language and culture of gender diversity to parents can really help, because they're coming to terms with and understanding something that they're not generally speaking a part of. Now, I was interested in what parents' reactions were in the main, like trying to get some larger scale generalizable work to kind of understand, how do parents react on the whole? And I found two studies. The first is 236 individuals completing an online survey, largely from Salt Lake City, from Spivey and colleagues in 2018. And the other is 129 transgender and gender diverse youth from across the US in various different cities, from Grossman in 2021 and colleagues. From the Journal of Homosexuality. So that's a good journal, very interesting, this study. And what they found, between them, they found that people were less supportive where they have more traditional gender role attitudes, not surprising, and where they feel a greater discomfort with violations of heteronormativity and cisnormativity. And basically, parents reported more frequent efforts to change gender nonconforming behaviors when their child was a trans girl, when they held more traditional attitudes towards gender role, and interestingly, if they had a warmer parenting style. So parents who had more traditional gender attitudes, who felt more discomfort, and whose child was assigned male at birth were more likely to try and control and restrict their gender nonconformity. Now, in this big study, 129 transgender and gender diverse youth, I realize this is from the States, and lots of places in the States are quite conservative. But for basically transitioning participants in the sample, we find that for trans feminine participants, 45% of mothers and 36% of fathers showed very positive or positive current responses to their child's gender identities. And for trans masculine participants, mothers start less supportive at 27%, positive or very positive, and become more to 53% positive or very positive reaction to their child's kind of identity and experience. But what we're finding here is that, at most half, but probably less than half of parents in this sample expressed positive or very positive reactions to their child's gender nonconformity or their child's kind of transgender and gender diverse identities. So as we hone in on an answer to Rishi Sunak's question here, we've talked last time about the increased risk of children, young people to abuse, right? And that's the obvious answer to the question. The first answer is, if you're going to out some young people to their parents, if you're going to out any young person as standard who's questioning their gender to their parents, you really do put them at risk of abuse, because you just cannot know whether a child is, how a parent is going to react to that information. But there has been the argument that, that's a safeguarding concern, and we're always a little bit cautious about sharing information with parents where there are safeguarding concerns, but that is a separate question. So we'll keep that to one side for a moment. But if we just put that to one side, we can see here that actually the relationship between children and their parents and coming out as LGBTQIA+ is actually very nuanced. It takes a great deal of time and is a negotiation, not only between children and their own breadcrumbs that they leave, but also between children, their breadcrumbs, and their parent and family's responses to those, and their peers' responses to those. As children and young people begin to question their own gender identities, they start to leave breadcrumbs as they start to experiment. They start to wonder, what feels right? What feels like home? What am I? And they do a little bit of experimentation, try and wonder what that might be. And that experimentation then leads to responses from the people around them, both their peers and school staff and parents and family. And wherever feels safer is going to be the place when they begin that process of gently leaving breadcrumbs, not only for the people around them to follow, but for themselves to follow, to find themselves. So this process is long, it takes time, and it's deliberate. And it has the child or young person at the heart of it with a great deal of agency. This is a scary world that they're coming out into. And it's a scary world to risk rejection from their parents. And as we see, rejection is not even particularly unlikely. And so children and young people know where to leave those breadcrumbs, and they do so gradually, little by little. They work out what's right. They test the water, and they work out how they're going to be accepted. And of course, that then is responded to by parents gently and slowly as they come to terms with their child's experience and try to understand it and come to terms with it, incorporate it into their understanding of the world, incorporate it into their ability to come out as a family to the wider community and to move forward together as a unit. It takes time. And it's got children and young people at the heart of it. They work out where to leave those breadcrumbs and whom they want to follow them. Now, this is where things get tricky, right? If we have a process, if we have a system or guidance that basically outs kids to their parents right at the first time when they're experimenting, as soon as we see those breadcrumbs land, we show them to parents. We take all of that agency away from children and young people. We interrupt this process. We may well expose parents to things they're not ready to see yet. Children and their parents are engaged in a natural process of negotiation. It's challenging. It takes time, but children are at the heart of it. They have agency in that process. And if we interrupt it, who knows where that will lead? There's also a role for education here, right? So rather than just telling parents every time children are starting to question their gender, there might be a role for educating parents to pave the way for children to start to question their gender. If we can create environments both at school and at home that are likely to be as inclusive as possible, where people have a language that they can share with their children and young people, so that if their children and young people are questioning, they have a way to describe and to describe and explain their experience to people and to themselves, then we can create a world where more people can find an easy place to belong, even if they're in unusual spaces on the gender spectrum. I want to leave you with one final quote, which I think does help to answer this question from Rishi Sunak. This quote's from Grishal Shade's study, the one we first started with. Here's the quote. While multiple participants shared positive experiences, the negative responses from parents and family consistently outnumbered the affirmations. For every participant whose parents said they could play soccer and didn't have to wear dresses, there were multiple family members who made their conventional gender norms clear. Only girls and gay boys do hair. Girls should be in the kitchen and wear dresses. You better hope she doesn't see you with that hair on. These responses may reflect what participants remembered, and they incorporate it into their narrative journey of becoming transgender or gender diverse. It may also simply reflect the reality that most transgender and non-binary young adults have had their hints about gender met primarily with ambivalence, confusion, and resistance. The examples of parent affirmation show that there is hope, though, and love. Between the lines and under the surface, there exists the unexpected human who sees our humanity, our inherent unconditional preciousness and lovability. A mother pushing back on her own parents. A piece of clothing that slipped into your uncle's shopping cart when he gives you a wink. Allowing that toy to be played with. They are far in between and few, and we are also affirmed. Not in the grand ways that counter or balance the adultism, disgust, and refusal we so often receive for our breadcrumbs, but rather in smaller, more infrequent ways that provide a wonderful exception. Thanks so very much for joining me, everyone. This is Classroom Psychology. You know what? Together, let's pave the way so that we can make a world where everyone can find a place to belong. I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.